So today we're going to be taking a look at a Traska. This is kind of their OP styled watch, simple three-hand, no frills, kind of do anything watch. I got it in the mint variety. I think it's a pretty nice package overall, so let's take a closer look. So we have a diameter of 36.5, lug to lug of 43.6, height of just 10.7 millimeters, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some of the general specifications for the watch, we're going to have the Miyota 9039 beating away in here. If you go for the date variant, you would have the 9019. Both good, just Miyota 9 series movements, helps the watch be a little bit thinner than you would expect at this price, which is lovely to see. We do have BGW9 for all the lume on the dial. The watch, of course, is 316L with Traska's classic proprietary coating that makes it a little bit more scratch resistant, or realistically a lot more scratch resistant. We do have a screw down crown with 100 meters of water resistance, a boxed and double dome sapphire crystal with under AR, which is nice to see. And last but not least, the watch retails directly from Traska for $620. To note, there is difference in pricing between the sizes. So if you go for the 34 millimeter, it's going to be $580, and for the 38, it's $635. So starting off with the dial here, and it's very classic OP-esque in its styling. We have rectangular markers for all the hours, a double marker here at 12. We don't have a lot of text on the watch either, just Traska, the logo at the top, which is the little Celtic knot. And at 6 o'clock we have automatic, and that is it. It's a very clean dial. There isn't really any information you don't need. Realistically, I don't even think you need it automatic, but I do like the balance that keeps between the 12 and 6 o'clock overall. We of course also have these pencil style hands, which are polished on the outside and have a brushed channel in the middle, which give it a nice kind of legibility. At some angles they have shiny bits, at others you can only read that brushed bit because the polished bits kind of just go away into blackness, so they are always visible, which is nice. We of course do have a seconds track along the outside as well, with the seconds hand going all the way out to that track. Nice to see. The seconds track done in black, and then larger little square plots for each of the 5-minute marks. I do really like the dial color they went for. This is now Traska's, I guess you can say classic, because they use it with all their models, mint green. And Traska uses, at least on this dial variation, a semi-matte dial finish. So it does a nice job at absorbing light, not being too reflective, but also not being lacquered and shiny either. So it's a very nice in between, a good casual kind of color, but playful enough to be just fun in an everyday watch and kind of do what you want to with it, as long as this color palette can fit in your life. All the markers are metal applied and with a lume channel in the middle. They aren't the largest of metal on the outside, so you don't get a lot of light play, but you do get enough, I feel. They definitely could have gone for a larger marker overall, but I do think it's more the lume giving it that interesting aesthetic of like a pure white marker. Definitely gives a sportier feel rather than pure dressy, with that lume being the most forward part rather than the finishing of the index. So zooming in here a little bit closer, and you can see the dial is done pretty well on close inspection. I love this little bit of a metallic finish you see with the paint on the dial. There's like little speckles of different shades of the color everywhere that just come together on wrist to be one pure color. See, the text has a little bit of three-dimensionality to it. I would like to see a couple more layers, a little bit more inkiness to both Traska and the logo there. When we start moving on to the markers, you can see there is little QC issues here and there. Like you can see there's a little bit of bubbling there at the bottom of the 12 o'clock. But as I mentioned, from wrist, the actual outboard of the marker is so small that you're not really noticing the finishing as a whole to the marker itself. What you are just noticing is the fact that it's fully polished and reflecting at you. One interesting aspect and something I do really like about these markers is the way they are cut. So you do have a completely flat topped base. Then as you look to the side, you can tell there is another facet, another area to that marker. And of course the last facet joining it to the end, more vertical to that dial portion. It is nice that they went for more than just a flat, boring rectangular marker. They did add some depth to it, and that's going to help the light play in the way that the watch appears on wrist. But again, they just aren't finished fantastically up close, because there are just like tiny marks on a lot of the markers here. You could say a marker like that is fairly clean with very minimal damage. A marker like that, even cleaner, but a little bit of just distortion in the metal itself. The markers are done beautifully for the lume, super smooth on top, no really large tufts of lume in an area it seems like it shouldn't be. So good job on them. Looking at the handset, we do have some of those similar issues, a little bit of speckling, a little bit of roughness along the edge of the hands as well. The actual little brushing down the middle center of the hands looks really good and grabs your eye, but again, there is just some roughness along both the hour and the minute handset. With that being said, I do like the overall shape of the hands. Because it's faceted on both sides, it gives this appearance of a little bit of a curve, or at least a gradual light play between the polished to brushed to polished again surfaces. It is a pretty handset. It's a pretty dial overall. There's a couple QC things here and there, but nothing that I think is out of the ordinary or is unexpected for the price. Taking a look at the watch in natural light, we can see it looks just as fantastic outside as it does inside. The dial is very clear. You can definitely get a feeling for that matteness in direct light. And it just looks nice. Even at extreme angles, it doesn't feel too reflective or anything like that. You still do get great legibility even though it has a domed and boxed sapphire crystal. The brushing of the metal really pops out nicely as well. It doesn't look cheap or uneven, and it just does capture the light and play with it really nicely overall. Looking in the shade, same story pretty much goes. You of course do get a little bit more reflection to the watch, and that's just kind of natural, but it's not overbearing. The watch is still completely readable. The metal as well takes on this beautiful matte tone in the shade, and the brushing is still beautifully reflective off the surface. It's just a little bit more gradual and soft, but it looks fantastic in my opinion. Moving on to the case of this watch, and this is just very classic oyster-esque case. Of course, Traska's doing some things to make it their own. The bezel, I think on average, is a little bit flatter than most Rolex bezels are. You do have a brushed top side and a polished edge leading up to that. It is, I think, a pretty classic feel to the case shape. It's very oyster-esque along the mid case here. You do have drilled lug holes. You do have a case back that sits a little bit into the wrist, so it hides even more of the height than you would expect. So again, it's under 11 millimeters already. Part of that is with the dome of the crystal on top of that, and the box of the crystal, so it is a relatively thin watch overall, especially on wrist. You do have primarily brushing everywhere. This more sunburst brushing here on the bezel, vertical brushing everywhere else from the top side. From the side, we have just high polish completely, going into the lugs as well. It's nice that they kept that rather than doing just all brushed everywhere. Until we get to the clasp, where we do have some brushing on the top of the clasp with the same Traska logo and some chamfering on the edges. To note, there is some very, very slight chamfering along the sides of the case, so much so that it's kind of hard to pick up at some angles. It's a very baby amount of chamfering, which to me, chamfering a lot of the times helps the top of the case lose some of that visual heft and typically wear a little bit thinner. I sent a message to John and he said that his goal for the 36 was to make a 36 that felt like it wore big, so I'm imagining that's why the chamfer is not as large as it could be. For example, I do also have the 34 millimeter version of this watch, which the 34 next to the 36 looks absolutely minuscule. It does not look like only 2 millimeters. But with that being said as well, you can see how much more dramatic the chamfer is on the 34 millimeter version of this case. You can see it takes so much more away from the brushing on the top side of the lug. It really eats into that real estate. Whereas here, the lug really almost just looks completely brushed. It's a very night and day in terms of how he decided to do that case. And from what I've heard, he's not at the moment going to be bringing this chamfering style to the larger size, but I do prefer the elegance that the more chamfered case brings. I'm sure because it's so flat, it does grab a lot of light pretty evenly along the bezel and disperse it nicely. But because you have a box and domed crystal, you do get a lot of that heft rising above the case of the watch. I don't know if maybe he was going for a vintage styling with that idea, but I do think a concave bezel would also look really nice. A little bit more of a slope bezel even. Of course, I'm not the watch designer. This was not my perfect watch, quote unquote. John was not trying to appease just me, so I'm sure this is what he went for, this is what he wanted, and it does come together nice in person. Looking at the crown, it does unwind very nicely, so we do have nice action there. The winding on the Miyota 9 series isn't too gritty at all. It's not very loud, it's not very screechy, or at least he went for a variant that doesn't feel very cheap and whiny, so that is nice to see. When we're pulling out the crown, there is no ghost date position on the note date version, which is nice to see. It's a true note date movement rather than him just taking the dated movement and just not showing you the date. Movement of the hand is very smooth and fluid, which is also nice to see. And realistically, it is a nice watch to operate. Looking at the case back, we of course have just like this sunray finish, some general info on the back, very classic Tudor Rolex styling there, and even more interesting because they actually put text rather than no text at all. We do of course have Traska's classic perlage on the inside of the clasp. I don't think it really adds anything to the watch, but also why not, I guess. What is nice about this new generation is that the watch now does feature quick release. So it is one of those things where I wasn't too hung up on the fact that the old version didn't have quick release, because you did have a lot of holes of micro adjust, albeit you can't use that on the fly. This is nice because you do just push down here and then this does extend out, and I believe you have 4 holes of micro adjust, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep. So that is nice to see. I will say the usability of this isn't perfect. It is a little hard to actually push that button there, or that lever there, or whatever you want to call it, to actually pull out the extra links. Sometimes if you don't push down enough, it's not moving at all, and it does feel like it needs an over amount of force to do it. So it's good, it's not perfect. I will also state, because the link is a rather flimsy around the part that is the micro adjust, sometimes unless you're holding very close to the part you're ratcheting in, once you get towards that last one, it's a little hard to get it in perfectly, so you have to really like hold in there and then press it. Again, it's not the biggest deal in the world. I'd rather it function like this than not have it here at all, but just to keep that in mind. One thing to note too is this San Martin watch, I believe, uses the exact same system for micro adjust, the same ratcheting system. This does actually have slightly more holes. I believe it has 5 ratchet areas, but it uses that same push button. If you look at the clasp mechanism, they both have that same kind of screw system in it. So I believe they're using fairly similar systems. The only difference is on the San Martin, it's very easy by comparison to push down that button for the micro adjust system, whereas if you move into the Traska, if I use the same amount of force I was doing on the San Martin, it's absolutely not budging at all. You really do have to depress it pretty intensely to get that to come out. I don't know if that's just a tolerance thing. I don't know if that's something that they wanted to go for because maybe this felt too flimsy. I'm not sure, but I actually do prefer the feel of this over this. And then just before we move on to how it wears, I do like the bracelet overall. We do have a really nice taper. It goes from 20 millimeters to 15.5 at the clasp, and then back up to 18 and change for the clasp itself. So you do have a very dramatic taper that's comfortable on wrist, that I like. And really there is no complaints. I think it tapers gradually enough. It's not too dramatic within the first 2 or 3 links. And it's comfy on wrist too. You do have a very silky backside of the link there. The edges aren't too harsh or sharp as well. So very comfortable bracelet overall. It just is interesting because now the clasp is almost kind of as thick as the watch itself in a sense. So it is one of those trade-offs, because if you're putting more mechanics to make a micro adjust system, it's going to be bulkier, it's going to be a little bigger. So some people might like that, some people might not. You could also tell this was the old clasp, which I bought this watch when it had the old clasp system, and then he upgraded to the micro adjust. You could tell that the whole system was a little bit shorter as well. So now it's gone from thinner to thicker and from shorter to longer. So if that's something you know is not compatible with your wrist, then that's unfortunate. But as it stands, it's not too bad. So moving on to how this watch wears. Earlier I was wearing my lovely Timex GMT here. And here we have the watch sitting on my 6.5 inch wrist. Now, again, online it says this is a 36 millimeter. I will say this really wears more like a 38, which is kind of interesting. Again, John at Traska was saying he was going for a larger wearing 36. Part of that's probably because the lugs are a little on the blocky side, because the bracelet starts at 20 millimeters and doesn't taper too dramatically, so you have a large stance from the top of the wrist. You don't have a lot of chamfering, giving elegance. So it does wear a little bit larger than I think you would expect, but it doesn't wear badly either. It's not overly long lug to lug. It's not overly thick. It definitely wears very nicely planted on the wrist. And even then, the clasp also doesn't dig or feel too crazy. It's also nice that they have very soft edges on all the parts that contact the skin. So it's a very comfortable and good system overall, I would say. Looking at it from more of a side view, you can see just how thin the watch feels on wrist. It doesn't really rise up off the wrist at all. There's no daylight shining through. It's a very nice, comfortable package, especially because those bottom parts of the case aren't sharp in any way. If I move my watch up there, I have closer to a 6.5-inch wrist. You can see the watch still wears perfectly fine, still room on both sides. So you can wear this absolutely on a smaller wrist, even though it feels bigger than 36 millimeters. So with that being said, you can only remove an extra full link from this system, meaning that you can only wear this watch pretty much as small as about a 5.5-inch wrist. 5.25 might be cutting it. It really depends on how loose versus how tight you like to wear your watches. But if you have a 5-inch wrist or under, you're probably going to be out of luck here because this watch does not go much smaller. So moving on to some other straps, here we have this nice gray nubuck strap by Delugs. I wouldn't 100% recommend this strap because I ordered 3 of them and they happen to just not always be the right size. Like this would fit on a 19 millimeter strap almost more easily than it does here because I think this is like 19.5, so you get some lug gap. But that aside, the colors work well, the kind of minty green and the gray, very nice, very interesting, a little bit different than having it on the bracelet. And what's nice too about having a watch this thin is it does wear nicely on thin straps because we just have a low profile in general. I will say, when I put on a strap, you can really just see how defined and squared off those lugs are. It's a very angular H kind of wearing case, and that's what gives it this larger feel on wrist. Here we have a much more intense strap that just happened to work perfectly. This is not for the faint of heart, but this is, I believe it's Kurung Snake. Very interesting green pattern. It does play really well off the minty green of the Traska itself. I think this is a beautiful combo and I dig it. This tapers slightly less dramatically than the Delugs does. It still goes down to 16, but it does it just a little bit more gradually. So you can see it looks a little bit more at home, at least in my opinion, on the more squarish case of the Traska. It adds a lot of fun to the watch, adds a little bit of a pop of color. Of course, the white tones in the strap playing off the white in the Lume. I think this is an awesome combo. For those that want to go super green but make it more serious, this is a Fluco Suede in this dark green. It goes from 20 to 18, so the taper's a little less dramatic. It's not as out of place feeling on the wrist, so let's get it on the wrist. This is one of those K-shapes where I think it looks more at home on the least amount of taper possible. This 20 to 18 looks perfect and much better than the 20 to 16s we were previously looking at. And this dark green I think is a beautiful, rich combo to the watch. A little bit more serious than everything else, but more fun than the bracelet. Now if we want to add some actual normal color, we have this beautiful kind of butterscotch caramel brown Buttero Leather strap. This is made by King Leathercraft, who doesn't make straps anymore, at least not at the moment. So you can get a similar kind of grain from Delugs or something like that. But again, cognac browns, beautiful with this kind of color tone of dial. This is another 20 to 18 millimeter strap, very minimal taper, looks right at home on the watch. Very beautiful, very fun. Nice bright light tones on the watch overall. And lastly, this beautiful white silicone strap. This one is from AliExpress, so this is like $2, which is great. Obviously plays off the white of the Lume tones, very thin, very comfortable, and just looks good on the watch. Nice bright summer option. This one is actually a 20 to 20 millimeter taper, so I mean literally no taper, and looks fantastic on the watch. Like I said, go for less taper on this size. If you went for like, let's say the 34, you'd probably want a little bit more taper. If you went for the 38, I believe the K-shapes are very similar, so that you would want probably a less tapered strap overall. Taking a look at the Lume here, clearly not badly done. Pretty equivalent Lume between the hands and the indices. In person, they look a lot more color matched than they do on camera. The hands look a lot brighter on camera. I will also say the watch just looks brighter on camera. It's not the strongest Lume signature. It does die quick-ish. They could have, I think, added more layers here. It's not the worst I've seen by far, but I do think they could have done a little bit better. Reluming and comparing to the Timex, of course, Timex brighter, more consistent, of course. Can definitely be an area for improvement for the brand. So pros and cons of this watch, I think one of the bigger pros out of the gate is I just do think Traska in general, but also for this model, is one of the best micro brands to go to at this price point. We're talking just around $600, and I think they bring amazing value for that. We have the Miyota 9 series movement, which makes the watch relatively thin. We have enough water resistance here. We have a screw down crown. Again, the build quality I think is to a standard, really even higher than you would expect. Pretty nice all around, feels very solid. For what you end up paying, the end package that you're getting is pretty much one of the best you can ask for, as long as you're not asking for the most original of designs. Moving on from that point, I do think that we have fantastic build quality here. The fact that we have the extra hardening coating, which is going to make your watch look pretty much new forever, is fantastic. The brushing is done very well on the watch. The accents of polishing, although a little sparse here, are done well and do catch the eye. It is just a nice watch, both in hand, on the wrist, and as a package overall. Like, just the feel and the finish of it is really good. I think this is a comfortable watch just to wear in general. I do like the way the bracelet tapers. I love the way the, I guess you can say, backside of the metal feels on wrist. It just feels nice on wrist. I think it conforms to the wrist well. It's not overly long lug to lug. It's nice to see a 36mm watch just in general being made. There's a lot to love here in terms of how the watch fits, and there isn't really much to fault Traska on in that arena. Now, moving on to the few cons the watch does have, and the biggest one in my opinion is just the fact that the chamfer on the lugs is pretty much non-existent. Like you saw with the comparison to the 34mm model, that had a much more defined chamfer. I think it looks more premium on the watch, and I would have loved to see it here. I don't quite know why they didn't go for it here. They'd mentioned they probably will not use it in the future. I hope they do. But the amount of chamfering that is there at the moment just feels like an afterthought. It's just a little sliver. It doesn't really catch the eye, and to me it doesn't really add much to the watch. You might as well have just kept it brushed or blasted or whatever you wanted to do with it. The polish doesn't do much to me, at least. Next, and one of these more definitive cons I think for the watch, is the micro adjust on the clasp isn't super nice in terms of the functionality of it. The lever to press down and actually use the micro adjust function is very hard to use. You have to put a lot of force into that to get it to move between any position. And on top of that, you have 4 positions of micro adjust, but that last position there, you actually have to have the link kind of at the right angle to be able to push it in kind of correctly, or else it just does not want to go in. So it's one of those things where it very much is a quote-unquote first generation product. It is not without its kinks, it's not without its quirks, but it is functional. You do have micro adjust, and you have micro adjust for $600, which not a lot of other people can say. So of course there's always something to complain about, but as far as complaints go, there's not that many with this watch. So final thoughts here, and I actually do love the watch in general. I've always enjoyed the Rolex LP. This watch being based off of that, I don't have any less of a love for it. The fact that this is a 1/10 of the price of the Rolex is fantastic, because it is not a 1/10 of the quality. It's much more close to 1-to-1, not quite. But you're getting a lot of watch for the money here, undoubtedly. It's well built, you're getting a lot of specs, it's ticking a lot of boxes for people, and I do think it's in contention to be that kind of one watch that does everything for somebody's collection. Can this be worn with a suit? Absolutely, especially if you go for one of the smaller versions, because it will slide under a cuff. It is thin, it is comfortable, but again, it's just as sporty. It doesn't scratch. You can take it on a hike, you can take it out doing anything. You can take it in the ocean, really. So it's really one of those watches where in theory you never have to take it off, and it looks good, I think, arguably in every situation. Are there things that can be improved? Of course. I think the printing overall on the dial should be improved, because you just need a little bit more three-dimensionality to all of those elements on the dial. I think the Lume could be better, but to be fair, I've personally never used Lume in my life, so it's neither here nor there for me. Of course, working on the chamfer, working on the micro adjust, but overall, it's a fantastic package, and I don't think most people will find much lacking here. You will be happy with this purchase. I think it can fit in a lot of people's collections very nicely, and I think you should probably give it a shot if you like it. But anyway, those are just my opinions. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.